2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam President. Dear members, we have been witnessing one of the most serious humanitarian crises in Yemen for years. Today, as many as 400,000 children fight for their mere survival. Families have practically no source of income. There is a general shortage of food. Millions do not have access to water, heating, or fuel. The civil war has so far claimed 233,000 victims. You cannot separate these problems from each other, of course. These all together make normal life in Yemen impossible. In the middle of COVID-19, these hardships have turned this country a true hell on earth. 8 million children do not have access to education. There have been religious minorities persecuted by extremists in this country. And we cannot ignore the excessive persecution of religious minorities, especially Christians in this country. According to Open Doors, a humanitarian organization, local officials simply refuse to pay out the financial aid for those in need if they belong to a religious minority. Such a breach of humanitarian principles is not a religious but a moral issue. The EU cannot accept this. Since the EU has no army and it has no significant influence over military operations, as Mr. Borrell has rightly said, the EU needs to use the tools with which it has a lot of experience. Europe should not play the hero here, nor issue threats. It should improve the efficiency of humanitarian actions. We need a humanitarian response that has been planned based on real needs in cooperation with the locals. This is key if we want to maintain Europe's credibility in the region. Thank you.
Bardzo dziękuję. W imieniu Grupy Postępowego Sojuszu Socjalistów.
Thank you very much. Now on behalf of S&D, I give the floor to Mr. I'm sorry, it is Mr. Tarabella who will take the floor. 2 minutes.
Monsieur le représentant.
Hi, Representative. This debate comes at the right time. I'm glad that my group pushed for it. We may be at a turning point in terms of the tragic situation in Yemen, a country tormented by a bloody civil war since 2015. It's also hit by a cholera epidemic, COVID-19 and famine. The situation on the ground in every part of the country is extremely serious. It's no surprise that the daily existence of the Yemen people has been described on many occasions by the UN as the worst crisis of its kind in 30 years. It is therefore a relief that the new US administration has decided to change tack and will no longer pursue the disastrous regional policy of Donald Trump and has already made important decisions. On that subject, High Representative, I would like Europe to act together and to make it clear what our position is, and to show that we are determined to do everything in our power to find a solution to the conflict, so that we can end the humanitarian crisis too. In the resolution that we have drafted and that we are going to vote on, we suggest the following. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are to a large extent responsible for the chaos in Yemen. Without denying the responsibility of actors in Yemen, the war using Western weapons and murderous raids have caused major damage to the people of Yemen, particularly the most vulnerable. We should continue to support an embargo on the sale of arms to these two countries, and we should refer the situation in Yemen to the ICC so that nobody in Yemen is unpunished for the crimes, the war crimes that they have committed. And in addition, there should be sanctions applied using the human rights mechanism adopted by the Council. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now, on behalf of Renew Europe, Mr. Barry Andrews for 1.5 minutes.
Chairperson HRVP Borrell, the UN humanitarian coordinator is clear in his view that the people of Yemen are being starved deliberately. The UN funding call for 2020 was 40% underfunded, as you know, and this has brought Yemen to the brink of famine. But it's not just a matter of funding. As you know, starvation has been used as a weapon of war. The United Nations Security Council called this out very clearly, that it is a breach of international humanitarian law and that it is a war crime. The resolution today calls on the EU to do three things: to contribute to a sustainable political process, to ensure adequate funding on the humanitarian side, and also to join the war against impunity. Because starvation is not the only war crime that is being committed in Yemen. There are multiple examples catalogued by the Yemen Data Project of assaults on civilian infrastructure, including hospitals, schools, markets, and even weddings. And this cannot go unpunished. This resolution is also unequivocal in calling for an end to arms sales. The EU common position sets out 8 very clear criteria that must be satisfied in order to allow arms sales to third countries. And very few of those criteria are met in relation to arms sales that are used in Yemen. And I think we have to be absolutely clear about that. Conflicts in the 21st century are very complex and long-running. Mr. Borrell, you're very fortunate in Team Europe here. The humanitarian community, the development community, and the full weight of the diplomatic community. We're adding our political voice today, and we hope that 2021 will not be another lost year for Yemen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now, on behalf of ID, Mr. Berg, 1.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Well, it doesn't seem so long ago since we were talking about Yemen, about the worst humanitarian crisis that the world is being confronted with. Nevertheless, this is a topic, for whichever reason, has not found its way onto its agenda. We're not even taking it as an urgency, which I find very surprising. Let me be clear. The international community has left Yemen in the lurch. The High Representative often satisfies himself with noting what the UN Security Council says and just reiterating that, talking about the Saudi approach to the conflict and a recognition of the territorial integrity of Yemen. Despite the assurances, this is being said that a Yemenite solution has to be found to a Yemenite problem. The High Representative, I'm sure, would agree that in the population of the south there's a lot of support for a separate state, and that at the moment in the individual political groups there are serious discussions with Houthis to talk, and the Southern Transitional Council. If these talks should have the prospect of success, then all options need to be on the table, and that includes a two-state solution. And finally, maybe I can give you some figures. Since the start of 2015, the European Union has spent 896 million euros in Yemen. At the same time, $3.6 billion has gone to Yemen from the international community. Is this really a policy that we think will provide a sustainable peace for Yemen? What it needs is a genuine political dialogue between the Yemenite fractions with an agenda defined by the Yemenites. Death and destruction is only what has really come from international.
Thank you so much. Now, on behalf of the Greens, Madam Hannah Neumann, for 2 minutes. I would really like to ask you to stick to allocated time. Thank you.
Dear colleagues, Yemen is indeed the worst humanitarian crisis around the world, and the people of Yemen are suffering in a way I think we can't even imagine. But it's also part of the story that this war is fought with weapons made in the European Union. The Eurofighter from Airbus is used to bomb hospitals in Yemen. The French Mirage bombers are used by United Arab Emirates to do exactly the same. Both airplanes are equipped with Mk-80 bombs manufactured by RWM, the Italian subsidiary of German Rheinmetall. And French DCI company is at the moment training Saudi soldiers on how to better launch rockets into Yemen. So we actually can do something as the European Union to stop this war. And that's why I think the message from our Parliament's resolution needs to be crystal clear. No more weapons, no more spare parts, no more maintenance until the war in Yemen is over. And Mr. Borrell, I really hope that the message from the next Foreign Affairs Council will be just the same, because this is the only way how we can build credibility to put pressure on Iran and everyone else who wants to make money or politics with the suffering of the people in Yemen to get out of this beautiful country and let the people of Yemen sort out their conflicts. And there's actually a window of opportunity, and Mr. Borrell, you mentioned that. The new US administration is doing exactly this. They are working on a suspension of all arms deals to Saudi Arabia and UAE and a diplomatic initiative, a new diplomatic initiative to end the war in Yemen. And I think we all in this room and beyond should do everything possible to make sure that the European Union picks up on this initiative and to build a transatlantic alliance to stop the war in Yemen and the suffering of the people of Yemen. Thank you very much.
Dziękuję bardzo, pani poseł. W imieniu Grupy Lewicy Parlamentarnej.
Thank you so much. Now, on behalf of the left GUE-NGL, I give the floor to Mr. Mick Wallace, 1.5 minutes.
Thanks, President and Commissioner or High Representative. The last line of Yemen's national anthem is "The world will not see a guardian upon my nation." Since reunification, foreign powers have been trying to carve up, exploit and pauperise Yemen and its people. Salah dutifully followed the IMF and World Bank reform programmes for 2 decades until the people of Yemen had enough. Obama helped install the puppet Hadi, promised change in elections. What Yemen got was more austerity, privatisation and land grabs by foreign investors. Ansar Allah put a stop to the plunder in 2014. They negotiated a deal with Hadi and others, making elections the top priority. But the Saudi-led coalition went to war to stop the prospects of peace, power sharing and independence in Yemen. With Western help and barely a word from the usual human rights defenders, they killed hundreds of thousands of Yemeni people and committed brutal crimes on a daily basis. They are still at it, and Yemen is still resisting. You say you care about democracy. Why don't you stop the genocide, stop the plundering of Yemen, and allow elections to take place? Who'd win? Well, that's none of our business. It's for the people of Yemen to decide that. Not the EU, Saudi Arabia or the UAE, not the US, not Russia, not China or anyone else. It's justice they need more than aid. And for too long, we've turned a blind eye. And the Yemenis are not for lying down.
Bardzo dziękuję w imieniu
Thank you so much. Now, Mr. Fabio Massimo Castaldo for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, President. High Representative, bombings, indiscriminate bombings, a cholera epidemic, famine. The Yemeni people have been through everything in the last 6 years. The naval blockade by Saudi is the latest act in this tragedy. In this dreadful proxy war, where even famine has become a weapon, we need to do something. The aid provided by the international community is not enough to counter this worsening situation. This is a race against time, where the price being paid is measured in human lives. Humanitarian aid is vital, but not enough. We need to see, well, the change in the American regime and offers a precious opportunity to move things along in the peace process. This is an opportunity that we can't and mustn't waste. And I'm proud to say that Italy, thanks to the courage of the Five Star Movement and Mr. Di Maio, has done its duty and asked for over 10,000 goods to be stopped moving towards Saudi Arabia. And this is something that we should all be doing. We have to do what this Parliament has been demanding for years, an embargo on exports of arms towards those fighting in Yemen. We need to put an end to ambiguity from the European Union. the Yemeni citizens have to be part of the solution. Otherwise, we'll just worsen the problem. As spectators, we are complicit. Hundreds of children are losing their lives, and Europe is silent. And this is not the Europe, and not, I want to say, not a complicit Europe.
Thank you so much. Now, Madam Kati Piri, 1.5 minutes.
In Yemen is going into its 6th year. And we cannot stand by as over half of Yemen's 30 million people threaten to fall into extreme food insecurity. As a senseless war that killed 500,000 continues to rage on with no regard for human life. 50,000 infants die in Yemen each year, and thousands of children are on the brink of starvation today. High Representative, I commend the work the Commission and the Member States have done to prevent greater humanitarian disaster in Yemen. But this is the moment to step up. The funding shortages faced by aid organisations must be addressed immediately. And we have to be honest, acute humanitarian aid only wins you the battle and not the war. All parties to this gruesome conflict must return to the UN negotiating table. Some welcome steps have been made in recent weeks. After years, the internationally recognised government returned to Yemen. And just days ago, US President Biden reversed the previous administration's disastrous policy on Yemen. And by ending support for the Saudi-led coalition, he was loud and clear. This conflict has no military solution. Yemen doesn't just need food, it needs peace. And this is the time to deliver. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Mrs. Rodriguez Ramos, for 1 minute, please.
Gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you, Chair. When a war becomes slaughter, when military objectives attack schools and hundreds of children die, children are mutilated, and 24 million people, 80% of the population in Yemen, are affected by hunger and may even die from hunger. Well, we have to make the most of the change in tack of the Biden administration, which is going to try to end conflict and is trying to end arms sales to Saudi Arabia and UAE. We need to try to obtain a ceasefire, and the member states need to stick closely to this ban on sales of weapons. We need to check final certificates to ensure that no weapons end up in Yemen. Otherwise, our humanitarian aid won't be enough, and what we bear on our conscience will be unbearable.
Thank you very much. Now, Mr. Riviere, for 1.5 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, President. Far out of sight, out of mind, according to the proverb. Over 6 years, there has been this awful war in Yemen. International coalitions in 2017 delegated this to the local powers, which is Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. There have been thousands of deaths, soldiers and civilians, and families are the victims of this. There is a very fragile situation in Yemen, despite the fact that it's the cradle of civilizations in the Middle East. But for years now, there have been disturbances. And once again, the EU is showing its impotence and its ineffectiveness in this area. We were naive about the Arab Spring and its results, and we are impotent in that we were unable to support the Syrian rebellion, and we're now seeing Islamist terrorists in Daesh who have managed to show their influence throughout the Middle East. The European Union doesn't condemn what's happening. Only member states have an influence in the region, and France is first amongst those. They're the only ones that provide credibility. This uncertainty is only going to grow, and the interventionist American president wants to give his country credibility, but will destabilize the region. The EU hasn't even provided a contribution in resolving this conflict. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Mr. Markart, for 1 minute, please.
Mr. Markart, for 1 minute.
Wir befinden uns im 6. Jahr dieses Krieges.
We are in the 6th year of this war. There are millions of people in need of aid. 12 million children. We have around 1 million children who are malnourished now. If you look at Yemen, this is one of the most serious humanitarian crises in the world, but it seems to be a somewhat forgotten crisis. That's probably because almost nobody has the possibility to flee to Europe from Yemen. There's a real shortfall in humanitarian aid. About half of what is needed is being provided. The EU member states are providing aid, but much less than should be the case. This is particularly sad because we're looking at the backdrop of a global pandemic. There's also dengue fever, cholera, as well as COVID-19, and the medical personnel has very little protective equipment. If we want to try and counter this terrible crisis, we need greater diplomatic efforts, but also money at the upcoming donor conference. Thank you.
Bardzo dziękuję. Głos zabierze pan.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Mr. Urban Crespo. 1.5 minutes.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, Chair. It's been more than 6 years now. Yemen has been the victim of a regional civil war with EU member states in the coalition bombing the country and making a profit by selling arms that are used to kill civilians in Yemen. But humanitarian crises are very often not natural disasters, even if they're treated as such here in this House too. There is an emergency, yes, but there are victims and there are interests at play here as well as responsibilities. The humanitarian crisis in Yemen has a very clear cause: war. And Saudi Arabia and its allies are responsible for that. Saudi Arabia is an absolutist, fundamentalist, misogynistic, homophobic and criminal regime. How is it possible that Saudi Arabia can continue to be a key partner of the EU? How can we have trading relations, military, diplomatic relations, normal relations with this country when they are bombing Yemen? That makes us complicit in the murders of citizens. Those bombs that are killing people, killing citizens in Yemen, have European brands stamped on them. So we have criteria for democracy and human rights which are applied to other countries. Why are they not applied to Yemen? Why is there no arms embargo on Saudi Arabia? Why not? Because there are too many interests at stake that make us hypocrites.
Dziękuję bardzo, panie pośle. Głos zabierze.
Thank you very much. Mr. Comín y Oliveres, 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Denunciamos las violaciones.
We firmly speak out against the human rights violations in Yemen. In 2009, unfortunately, Spain continued to export arms to Saudi Arabia when you were Foreign Minister, Mr. Borrell. We said this time and time again in the European Parliament, that you cannot defend human rights without credibility. Are you not ashamed. Now you are calling for Navalny to be released without speaking about the political prisoners in Catalan. Are you not ashamed of this? You are meant to be representing the EU, and if Russia humiliated you, it's because of your silence as to what is happening in Spain. You're simply hiding behind your role in the EU. Spain is going to lead the EU to diplomatic disaster, and you are the face of that disaster. That is your responsibility, Commissioner.
Dziękuję bardzo, panie pośle. Głos zabierze pani poseł.
Thank you. Ms. Arena has the floor for 1 minute 30.
Merci.
Thank you very much. Every 10 minutes in Yemen, a child under the age of 5 dies of malnutrition. We've been debating here for half an hour now, so you can do the sums. This is the result of a war that Saudi Arabia and its allies have been conducting against Yemen. But it's also something that is within the responsibility of the member states of the European Union. We are the second largest exporter of arms to this country. We are a direct accomplice in the atrocities that are being committed in Yemen. Despite the common position of September 2019, when the member states are called upon not to send arms or other military equipment that could be used for internal repression to Yemen, and committed not to contribute to instability. Well, yes, conflict resolution takes time, but famine does not wait. The European Union must continue its humanitarian action on the ground. The decision taken on Friday by the new American president is some good news for a change. The European Union should seize this opportunity. I know you're going to do that, and you should take the initiative within the United Nations, adopting within the Security Council a world arms embargo to all parties involved in the conflict in Yemen, and calling for an end to hostilities.
Thank you. Mr. Kiuchuk, 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President. Dear colleagues, the humanitarian situation in Yemen is the worst in the world. Widespread hunger, disease, attacks on civilians and violence every week, every day, every hour. This human tragedy, which has been exacerbated by more than 5 years of war, became increasingly deadly with increasing obstructions of faith, collapse of countries' economy and the COVID pandemic. The conflict has displaced more than 1 million people, and over 24 million people, 2/3 of the population, requires food assistance. Yes, Mr. Borrell, you are right, this must stop immediately. The EU High Representative and the EU member states have to condemn in the strongest terms the gross violation of international humanitarian law, and to put pressure on both sides to advance the political process and reach a nationwide ceasefire. In the same time, the EU should mobilise additional resources to address the situation in country and to ensure equitable access to vaccines against COVID-19. Thank you.
Bardzo dziękuję. Głos zabierze.
Thank you. Mr. Urtasun, 1 minute.
Thank you, Chair. Dear High Representative, Yemen has been plunged into a civil war for 6 years, as my colleagues have been saying. During 2020, the armed conflict has not only continued but also intensified, resulting in blatant human rights violations conducted by all parties involved. All parties need to urgently implement the global ceasefire call contained in the UN Security Council Resolution 2532. Since 2016, this Parliament has repeatedly called for an EU-wide arms ban on the members of the Saudi-led coalition. And while some EU member states have already done so, Others continue to transfer weapons in breach of our common position on arms exports. There can be no military solution to that conflict. After 6 years, we cannot continue to turn a blind eye to the violence, human suffering and loss ravaging Yemen. It's the moment for the EU, Mr. Vice President, to assert its role as a peace broker and to seize the opportunity of the election of the new US administration to really have an initiative to build peace in the region. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Mr. Sinčić, 1 minute.
Kolegice I kolege, ono što se događa.
Dear colleagues, the situation in Yemen is a disgrace for humanity. This is the poorest Arab country that was hit by war and cholera. The Saudi Arabia intervened and weapons were provided by the West. The UN thinks that Saudi Arabia committed war crimes for bombing public facilities. We in Europe are trying to help those citizens 80 or 90 years old and higher. We do not perceive the virus of hunger and famine spreading across the world. Thousands of children have died because of hunger, and millions are malnourished. We are talking about famine, which is at the highest level in the last century. Until when shall we continue with this hypocrisy in the media and wider?
Thank you. Mr. Majorino, 1 minute.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you very much, President. In Yemen, something truly dramatic is happening. It's undervalued. Many people were killed. 14 million people are now facing hunger. The survival of 25 million Yemenis depends directly on humanitarian aid. To use Antonio Guterres' word, this is the worst crisis the world has seen in decades. We need to identify those who are responsible. It's the coalition led by Saudi Arabia that has upon its conscience a whole series of violations of human rights, but it's also on our own consciences. Since 2015 and 2018, 2 billion euros has been sold to the coalition, and we need to turn the page upon this. I call upon the Italian government to suspend arms sales to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, and it's even more important that President Biden should do the same. We need to ensure the EU is more decisive on this front.
Thank you. Mr. Solé.
Gracias, Presidenta. Yemen means the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. Many terrible figures of human suffering and human failure have been mentioned during this debate. We desperately need more diplomatic efforts to trigger a wide and inclusive political process. After 6 years of war, all contending parties have to understand that no further military offensives will end the conflict. But for the war to stop, we also need our member states to stop fueling the conflict by selling arms. US President Biden has recently announced the suspension of arms sales to Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. We, in the EU, should ban sales of arms or any military equipment to the Saudi-led coalition. Member states who have only frozen such exports should permanently revoke all export licenses. With their arms sales, which break the EU common position, many EU member states, with Spain ranking prominently, are complicit with the prolongation of this terrible war. It's time for them now to be complicit with peace.
Thank you. Ms. Alterman, 1 minute.
Fru talman.
Madam President, High Representative, Mr. Borrell, I wanted to show you something. It's a picture of a child. We've spoken a lot about what's at stake here, children who are starving, and I think about myself. When I watch the pictures from Yemen, I see pictures of malnourished children on the verge of being killed by malnutrition. And I see my own children playing happy, free and well fed. So we have to keep our eyes on this, not turn away. All too often we simply don't realize what is happening. This is something that should have been consigned to history. For many years I thought that famine was something that was part of the past, that the world had overcome famine. But we have to remember this at all times. We have to focus on helping these children achieve freedom. Yes, food, but also peace. Thank you.
Pani poseł.
Thank you. You cannot show images in the chamber. I just wanted to remind you of the regulation. Mr. Saturi, 1 minute.
Monsieur le Haut Représentant.
High Representative, fellow members, over and over again we say how terrible the situation is in Yemen. It's the worst crisis worldwide, according to humanitarian organisations. We cannot just remain impotent in the EU. We need to revise arms sales to Saudi Arabia, including the French government. We need to stop this after-sales service too. We need to stop these contracts for arms sales. We can't play at being impotent, claim to be powerless. There are things we can do. The EU and its member states should provide urgent support for the creation of a clear mechanism for collecting evidence of crimes and take this to the International Criminal Court. We need urgent humanitarian assistance and we need to act effectively as soon as possible. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo. W tej chwili poproszę o zabranie głosu.
Thank you. I shall now give the floor to the Vice President of the Commission, High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Mr. Borrell.